at odds with the Bible. And this is what they admit. This is this particular article. Yes, if you think the Bible has to be interpreted literally, evolution contradicts the Genesis story that God created all organisms in their present form. But you can believe in God without believing that the Bible is literally true. Well, no, I don't think you can. So what are the implications? If we as humans began life as an inanimate collocation of atoms, progressing through processes of incremental additions to a finally sapient, and of course that's just meaning you're human. Sentient means you're conscious, sapient, and I guess the only difference between being sentient, which is conscious, and sapient, which is human, is that you have a sense of morality, actually. You have a sense of right and wrong. Have you ever wondered, does a dog have a sense of right and wrong? You probably should say yes, because a dog can certainly look guilty. You know, if you've told them not to be on the couch and you come in there and they're on the couch, ooh, they look guilty. But guess where their reference point is? Their reference point is you. You are their God. That dog doesn't really think being on the couch is actually a bad thing. It doesn't think it's a bad thing to go and kill the next door neighbour's guinea pigs or chooks. Of course, it feels bad if it gets caught, but its reference point is you. It's not actually moral, whereas you are. Just as a little aside, and I've got to be careful how many asides I do, but working in Africa for a few years, and it was interesting just within the animist cultures. There's no question that we carry the same moral foundation, and it's very easy. In fact, it's the golden rule, or essentially as Christ said, do unto others as you would have them do to you. Everybody knows how you want people to behave towards you. Is that correct? You want people to be kind, you don't want people to cheat, you don't want people to lie, etc. All of that is true. And foundationally, that's the foundation of what the Bible is. It's actually selflessness. But animals don't tend to have that. The God of the Bible, if the God of the Bible did not create us, then... Okay, what is it? Okay, the God of the Bible did not create us, or God chose to miscommunicate the simple details of our origins in the biblical record. So, either God didn't create us at all, that was one possibility, or I'm thinking that God did create us, but he just didn't write the Bible very well. I mean, it's very easy for God to get up and say, oh, over eons of time you became what I intended you to be. That's not a difficult concept. And I hear people saying, oh, you know, God, you know, that was a concept for, you know, mature minds now and not for ones back. No, God could have done that very easily. So if he didn't do it, in other words, if he did it in a different way to what the Bible said, then God's not a very good communicator. Either way, this would indicate to me that either God did not exist or the God of the Bible could not be trusted. Is that fair enough? That's pretty logical. So, did we really evolve? That's the question. So, let's clarify a few issues here, because when I've actually been to some of these, even within our own church, I've found that what tends to happen is people will throw a whole lot of stuff together and not follow through with the logic. And unfortunately, in one fairly short talk this morning, I'm not going to be able to give you everything, but I hope I might be able to give you a little sense of where we can go with this, at least the logic of how it builds up. The origin of things in nature are divided into three main areas. We've got the origin of the universe, space, time and matter. Now, would you agree that you have to start there, space, time and matter? If you don't have space, time and matter, you don't have us. So the origin of the universe, the origin of the Earth and the solar system. So you've got space, time and matter, which is essentially just the laws of physics. And then you've got the Earth and the solar system. Fascinating how that sort of seems to be set up for life. There's none others that's been discovered yet in the universe. And then the origin of life. Man, animals, plants, microbes, etc. So you've got those three things. The origin of carbon-based life, that is, the first self-replicating organism. Now, if evolution is true, you've got to start there, haven't you? The first that's the cell, single cell. The origin of increasing complexity, because isn't it true that if you start off with nothing, and then you've got something, the first cell, then somehow you've got to build up to, some may say I'm not particularly complex, but I'll point to Jack. Something as complex as Jack, which is not just physically, but emotionally, intellectually, morally, all of those kind of elements. So we've got to get up to there. The origin of this idea of sentience, being conscious, the fact that you are awake and are self-aware, And then the concept of this sapience, this morality element. Where does all that come from? Am I true in saying that these are important questions that have got to be answered? You have to. Because if you're going to be serious about it, that's what you're going to answer. So whatever is put up to actually choose, okay, I'm going to choose this over this, you've got to be able to answer all those questions. So that's the first thing. So what about evolution? Evolution can only refer to the development of life once matter is formed. People use the term evolution a lot. Now I have had an academic appointment in one of our large medical schools for the last 15 years. And so I do get to do a little bit of teaching. I like the idea of teaching, and I don't get to do it as much as I would like. So I'm a little bit envious of some of you, even though Richie might have thought that some of you might be a little bit jaded maybe by now. But I had some students that came in a particular assignment that they were doing. It was a group assignment, and there was 3 of them. And they came into my office, and they were telling me about the assignment and just asking whether they were going in the right direction. And one guy happened to be saying, he says, you know, we're not sure that we're going in the right direction. As it's evolved, we've sort of ended up in this place. And I said, there's your problem. He said, oh, what do you mean? I said, well, if your project has simply just evolved, it means there's been no intelligent input. Look, it went over their heads. They really didn't get it. But I thought it was pretty funny myself and have a bit of a chuckle. So I said, no, this is a problem, whatever. But we use the term evolution a lot, don't we? We use this evolved, that evolved, you know, our programs are evolving. No, they're not. They're developing. Well, if they are evolving, then unfortunately they're probably getting worse because there's been no intelligence that's going into it. So just be conscious of how you use the term. But anyway, evolution can only refer to the development of life once matter is formed. Is that true? Because the concept of evolution is choosing the fittest, isn't it? It actually can't even be the first cell. And there is incredible problems with actually getting the first cell, which is why nobody's actually worked it out. It just doesn't exist. It's not there. There's plenty of theories, but none of them actually work. So the origin of the universe must be considered a separate process. When somebody says, you know, this is the evidence, and I've sat in on lectures where they've talked about the Big Bang Theory, and I've actually got a colleague down in Melbourne who I got to come up once to give some talks around this because his whole PhD was around angular momentum of the universe and general relativity. And I love talking to people, stayed with us over the weekend, love to talking to people who actually do understand Einstein's theory. Fascinating to go through the maths with it. Not that I could understand it all, but you know, he was just brilliant with all of that. And he actually became a 6-day creationist because of his PhD work, showing that it's absolutely impossible to get, well, in his case, just the angular momentum. In other words, just the movement. Everything circles, everything moves. And you can't get that out of the Big Bang. There's a lot of problems with it. But even if all of that were demonstrated, does having space, time and matter imply evolutionary process is true? It doesn't. It is actually logically disconnected. Now, you need space, time and matter before you can actually have evolution. But having space, time and matter and the laws of physics in the universe does not actually prove the evolutionary process is true. Am I right? I am right. Sorry to say. And I don't mean to sound arrogant, but that's the logic. So the validity of evolution can only be evaluated in reference to the development of living things. So this is what's all going in my mind, and I'm just thinking, okay, well, where am I going to start? And fortunately, as a life scientist, I've got some skills in this area. So I thought, well, looking at evolution and just starting off with what actually works once you've got it all together, that makes sense. Let me start there. So the neo-Darwinian model must explain the origin of the initial proteins, nucleic acids, the forming of the first cell. And like I said, there's a huge amount of issues and discussion and lots of different theories that have been thrown around. None of them. Nobody's out there telling you that they've got the answer to that because there is no answer to it. The gradual development of increasingly complex genomes. Now let me just start with the first cell. You know, with a cell, you've got DNA, right? And you've got RNA. Now, very simple sort of high school biology. You know, you need to have the DNA, which has got instructions in it, and then you've got the RNA, which can help to transcribe those instructions, and then it's got to go through to proteins, which help to then make or at least goes through the ribosomes and sort of makes the proteins that come out the other side. Which ones come first? The DNA, the RNA, or the protein? Oh, you've got self-replicating RNAs. Yes, that was one of the fascinating things that came out at one stage. And they stick there. They don't do anything. There is no process where you can actually develop from any of this to produce anything that's complex. Then, once you even get the first cell, you've actually got to move up from what we've said, from something simple to something complex. Now, I'm not going to do too much science here, but I need you to follow me. And unfortunately, as I was saying to Jack, one of the problems that I have with this is that I would love to be walking you through something like a hologram so that you can actually see some of the complexity with it without me using words. Because when I use words, unfortunately, people's eyes start to glaze over. And sadly, it's kind of like it's missing the point. But let me keep going. Then you've got to have the parallel development of all critical symbiotic members within the ecosystem. What do I mean by that? It means that even if you started with the first cell, and let's just say you got that far, then that one started to develop, and it started to develop into something like maybe a plant. But do plants exist on their own? They don't. There's whole ecosystems that have got to develop around them. And in fact, we know that when we damage the ecosystems, even slightly, you can end up sending lots of species extinct. And so if you're going to develop up this highly complex thing that we've got of plants and animals and insects and birds and all the rest of it, you've actually got to develop it up in a very coordinated way. And yet there's absolutely no evidence for that, and certainly nobody's put together a complex or anything that's believably complex. So these are just some of the things that are going in the back of my mind. Let me just tell you a little bit about human beings, so how you got here. And it was interesting to note the number of pregnancies and new babies being born and that sort of stuff. So obviously there's not too much stress within the teaching profession to allow... I can tell you there's very little in academia, which means we must be much more stressed than you guys. And I have no children, so clearly that's the problem. But let's just follow through what's happening, even just in the development of a baby. We start off, and the great thing is you do start off as a single cell. But you've started off with gamete from the mum, the egg, gamete from the dad, the sperm. I'm just watching the time. I would love to, I was asked to give a talk at the hospital where doing some, for expectant mums and dads, or mums and dads for who wanted to have antenatal classes, basically that. These are people that wanted to get pregnant. And so they wanted to have somebody give them a lecture about what are the things that they need to do to make sure that they're healthy enough in order to get pregnant. There's some fascinating things in there. Maybe we can do an impromptu this afternoon, but not that you need any more help. You guys are doing pretty well. But it's just fascinating when you're having a look at these, just the cell and the egg and what the body has to do to try and keep them healthy. I'll stop there. But anyway, the point is that, the exciting thing is, even if they make it, which is very improbable, but there's all sorts of things to actually ensure that the best ones actually get to connect up. And looking around this room, it's very clear that the best ones did connect up numbers of years ago, and that has made you. But once they connect up, the first one, there's millions of sperm that are sort of trying to sort of go for it, but fortunately, the one with the most power makes it there, burrows through the outside of the egg, they're called the zona pellucida, and then once it's burrowed through and it actually connects just underneath the surface, the cell membrane, the potential changes immediately. So all of the other sperm that are trying to burrow in get rejected. And then what happens is that the males, the DNA, the genetic information gets squirted into the cell. Now you think, well, that sounds pretty easy. Okay, membrane, that could have happened fairly easily. But now it squirts this in. And if you've ever watched, I've watched an animation of it, and I haven't got it here, but you actually see them come together. Because remember that you've got billions of base pairs here, and they've got to all line up, the male and the female. And it's all done by chemistry. This is not magic. It's all done by chemistry. But it was pre-programmed. Somebody started to put it all together and said, you know, if you do this, then do this, and then this will happen. And it gets together and it lines up so that hopefully all your genes are lined up. And then once they're lined up, boom, you've got your first cell. So now you've got the zygote. This is conception. Now we've got our first cell. What happens from here? Well, fascinating. We've got embryogenesis. So it just divides till you get between 8 and 16 cells, and now they're all exactly the same. You've all heard of, you know, when people take, they want to make, you know, a clone of somebody. And this is the point at which they make the clone. They actually make it from the blastocyst here, and they will actually take one of those, and you could make exactly the same thing, because they're what they call pluripotent stem cells. So these stem cells can literally make exactly the same organism, but only until it gets up to about between 8 and 16. And then it starts to do what we call differentiate. And this one decides, well, I'm going to be the nervous system, I'll be the head, I'm going to start to make the organs in a very coordinated way. How does it know which genes to do what? Are you just getting a sense of, is this thing a little bit complicated? Brilliantly complicated. Brilliantly complicated. I can tell you it's embarrassing to some extent. As a scientist, my area of research is in the neurosciences, but there's one particular pathway that if you ever want to sort of spend an afternoon with me, I'm happy to talk to you about it ad infinitum. But you know, what we call the kynurenine pathway, foundational. We may actually get the elixir of life from there eventually. But we've worked on one pathway for probably the last 20 years and still don't understand everything about it and how it connects. And this is one small part of everything that's going on here. There's an absolute, it just blows my mind. So anyway, if we keep going on, of course, you get that further development. And of course, the fact that you're existing here and that many of you have children suggests that this happens fairly readily. And ultimately, we're able to produce a baby. Now, it's not just cells dividing as simple protoplasm going here. Clearly, all of those organs have had to develop at the right time. Also, if you have a look at the skeletal structure, not only that, but within the skeleton there's holes in different parts of the bones, isn't there? And what goes through those holes? Nerves and blood vessels. Now they've had to develop, and those holes have had to develop so that the nerves can actually develop and go through. I mean, there are many little elements like this that I could tell you, which just, and the reason why I'm telling you this is that I want you to be thinking, what is it that we're trying to explain? This is what we're trying to explain. You is what we're trying to explain. The degree of complexity that's required to produce just you, let alone the complexity that's out there in the rest of the ecosystem and the environment, which all have to be done in a way which will sustain you. So when we get our minds in that kind of perspective, and as I did this myself, I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, this is a pretty complex thing. Is evolution, which I was convinced was true, is it actually able to do this? Can it produce what we've got here? So we've gone here from a simple zygote, a single cell, to within around 9 months, this breathing baby, which then, of course, has then another 25 years before it's actually fully developed. And incidentally, the brains, and I really want to mention this particularly to teachers, you know that the brains, well, adolescents, between the age of probably around about 12 and 18, is going through what's called a synaptic explosion, where they're redeveloping the hindbrain, particularly through to the prefrontal cortex. It's a time when they really don't want to be doing things like certainly alcohol, and I would argue caffeine in there as well. But, and it's probably up until about the age of 25, certainly for men. It's just that we're slower. So we've gone from single cell to this complex. I don't think anybody will disagree that it is, if we're going from single cell to something like this, that we've gone from something that's very simple to something that's extremely complex. Is that true? So no question we've gone to that point. So the DNA contains those instructions, we're building those. Evolution assumes we've gone from no information to a little bit of information to a massive amount of information. So within the genome, and even as we're finding now all the non-coding regions and you know, how you can actually have you know, one gene, yes, from one stop codon or start codon to a stop codon, but then you can have genes that are coding over the top of it, and then you've got a whole lot of post-translational modification. So even one section of the DNA can be coding for many, many different proteins and various other elements as well. So we're not just talking about something that's simple, we're talking about something, it's not just getting the bases in the right place, but there's this whole extra called epigenetics. Now I know that some of you will have heard of epigenetics, but this is actually what switches things on and tells us whether it's switched on and switched off, and it's putting methyl groups here, what they call methylation and acetylation patterns. It excites me, I just wish I could... Yeah. Anyway, to be valid, any explanation that describes the origin of life must outline a way in which the information contained in the cell's DNA can develop. That's just the bottom line. If you're going to be honest, that's what you've got to be able to do. Whatever the process is, it's got to be able to produce that. It's got to be able to produce at least the DNA that's in you. And I figured if I worked out that it was possible for the human being, then of course I can sort of, you know, everything else is sort of going to fall into place. If it's not working out for the human being, then I don't think this is a theory I can follow. So natural selection. This comes from Dawkins' The Greatest Show on Earth. This is one of his earlier books. This is interesting. It was actually given to me by a student of mine as I had, it was a very smart student actually, second in the year. I can't help but talk about some of this sometimes, and it's great having the interaction with the students. And she probably thought that I was a little ill-informed about some of the things, so it was necessary to sort of get me up to speed. I've read an awful lot around this topic, but I won't critique the author, but it's interesting that, you know, these are the powerful arguments that the author is putting forward. Breeders are almost like modelers with endlessly malleable clay, or like sculptors wielding chisels, carving dogs or horses or cows or cabbages to their whim. True. Natural selection is a mechanism that, like sculpting, can remove from the original, but it cannot add. Let me just go back to this one. If I take a breed of dog, let's just say I take a breed of dog. And I want to get dogs that, in fact, they've done this with foxes. And they did it up in Russia. And they took the foxes, just caught them. Cute little guys, but they're not very human-friendly at that point. And they bred all of the ones, so they selected out the ones over a number of generations. They selected the ones that actually had more of a interaction with humans. So the ones that actually kind of would take food from the hand of humans, they would select those ones and breed them up, and then do the same with that litter and the same with that litter. Until eventually they actually had a breed of foxes, which its ears had become floppy, which is interesting. And there was a couple of other traits that kind of matched more like what we've got as the domesticated dog. But these were bred. Now the question is, in that group of now domesticated foxes, compared to the wild ones that were there, which one has the richer gene pool? The wild ones have the richer gene pool. So there's actually more genes in the wild ones than there is in the ones that were bred out, correct? Same sort of thing if I take a Chihuahua, or at least I breed down to a Chihuahua. Will I ever be able to get back from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane? I won't be able to, because I've actually selected out. So Dawkins is correct here. He's saying it's like sculpting. We're able to take away, but we can't actually add. And there's nothing in there that is actually adding. I'll talk about genetic mistakes in a minute. So natural selection is a mechanism that, like sculpting, can remove from the original, but it cannot add. And just in case you've missed what this means, let me just say that this whole group here, we all got marooned on, I can say, Stradbroke Island. Oh, let's do Bribey. It's closer, but no bridge. And let's just say, well, no, we'll go a little bit further. Anyway, we get out there in the Whitsundays and we're on an island, and there's food there, but there's no water. So we've got to swim across a channel of around about 400 metres, which has got a bit of a current going through it. Now, there's probably enough variety in here. There's going to be a few of us that might make it to the other side and get our drink of water and be able to come back. Now, unfortunately, we can't bring it back to anybody. But the ones that are actually selected for, what are we selecting for? Swimmers and stamina and hopefully shark repellent deodorant or something. So we do select out. So are we going to miss a few people? Is there a few people that aren't going to make it? Yeah, that's true. That's right. All the accountants. I'm just joking. I was trying to choose something that you weren't there. I was going to say the musicians, but no, but you will select out few. So ultimately, the ones that are left have a much poorer gene pool than the ones that were that ultimately you started with. Correct? So natural selection always pulls away, and it's a very important mechanism within our society, particularly in an ecosystem which requires us to adapt to different environments. So as a process, natural selection cannot add to the complexity of the genome. So as a simple process, natural selection doesn't add anything. Yes, you can end up with selection, but it doesn't actually add anything. Is that going to help us get from simple to very complex? Can't. There's an interesting study by this guy called Dr. Lenski on E. coli. And does anybody know what E. coli is? So E. coli is probably the most prolific bacteria in your gut. You've got over probably about 1,000 different types of different bugs in the gut, but E. coli or Escherichia coli. Now, he started back in 1988, and I'm sorry that I'm pointing to this side, everybody, but it's just easier. So 1988, university founded 12 cultures of E. coli and grew them in the laboratory generation after generation for over 20 years. What he wanted to do was simulate the generational changes, so whatever, might have happened in terms of genetic mistakes that might have occurred over those generations, simulating the human evolution, if you like, looking to see evolution in action. And they did. After the equivalent of millions of years of human evolution, generations 31,500, the capacity to metabolize citrate. Now, citrate is just it's just an acid, actually, that's the alkali form. As one of the energy sources under aerobic conditions occurred in one strain. Now, it's interesting, citrate is something that you all use, your body's using it all the time. It's actually in what we call the TCA cycle. These bacteria would generally not use it when there was aerobic conditions. But when it became, so aerobic just means there's oxygen around. So when there's oxygen around, it can use other sources. But when the oxygen was gone, it would then pop a little protein out on the cell surface and start to use citrate. So citrate would start to come in. So this occurred due to mutations in a transporter that's just allowing things to get inside the cell during aerobic conditions. So, and I've tried to animate it, this just may not be helpful at all. But there's citrate, and if there's oxygen around, simply while you're sitting here breathing, can't get in, see? But if there's no oxygen, there's a little, you see that little protein ended up there? Now, those proteins will let in the citrate. So then it will use that and metabolize that. Is that making sense? All right, so what happened was, now, even with oxygen there, the protein stayed there. Everybody got very excited about this, saying, well, this is evolution in process. Published in some of the best evolutionary journals. I think I've got the journal down here somewhere. But anyway, so what do you think? I mean, if this were a class, I'd just say, what do you think happened? Well, yes, the proteins normally wouldn't be there because they would be taken away, but the mechanism that would normally take them away has been damaged, and so they're just there all the time. It's a little bit like you leaving your gate open. Normally your gate's only open to let the kids come in, whereas now it's jarred, it won't close, so it just stays there the whole time. So all the neighbourhood kids come in. All right. So normally bacteria take up and use citrate as an energy source only when there's no oxygen, anaerobic. Lenski suggested possible explanations were previous functional transporter, basically what I've said, is just been co-opted, existing transporter co-opted for the citrate transport. So has there been anything new developed here? No, this is an example of something where there has been nothing new developed. So nothing new was created, the existing system was instead damaged. And this is actually what does happen when we get any of the genetic mistakes that are occurring. But some people will talk about particularly sickle cell anemia for things like malaria. And living in Africa, there's no question, I got malaria twice. It's a very unpleasant thing to have. Some of you may have had it. And no question, without the drugs, I would have died, certainly the second time, because you just feel absolutely so tired because the parasite is actually infecting your red cells and actually not allowing you to have the red cells needed to transport oxygen. But if you've got sickle cell, the parasites can't actually quite get in there and they can't live in there, so you're actually a little bit more resistant. The only trouble is that being sickle cell, it doesn't transport oxygen as well, so that's not good for you anyway. This is an interesting one. Mutations causing humans to become less intelligent. This is a Dr. Crabtree, who was from Stanford. And he published a study conducted to try and identify the progression of modern man's intelligence. He thought that we might be actually progressing upwards. Let me just read it. According to his research, published in 2 parts, starting, it was actually a couple of years ago, Our Fragile Intellect, Part 1, Dr. Crabtree thinks unavoidable changes in the genetic makeup coupled with modern technological advances have left humans, in his words, well, kind of stupid. He has recently published his following analysis, and in it he explains that of the roughly 5,000 genes he considered the basis for human intelligence, a number of mutations over the years have forced modern man to be only a portion of as bright as his ancestors. We as a species, he says, are surprisingly intellectually fragile and perhaps reached a peak 2,000 to 6,000 years ago. Now notice he's not writing with any agenda. That's his version based on looking at the accumulation of genetic mistakes. If selection is only slightly relaxed, one would still conclude that nearly all of us are compromised compared to our ancient ancestors of 3,000 to 6,000 years ago. In fact, he suggests here, and he's written that article in 2 parts, but he suggests there that, in fact, if we were to take a student from about 3,000 years ago and have them in our classrooms, we would find that they were probably the most intelligent and most emotionally balanced out of anybody, apart from being athletically fit and all the rest of it as well. Because we are accumulating genetic mistakes, none of which seem to be doing us any good. Another geneticist by the name of, and this Sanford is from Cornell, we have reviewed compelling evidence that even when ignoring deleterious mutations, mutation selection cannot create a single gene within the human evolutionary timescale. Now, I haven't put up any sort of probability statistics here for you, but they are astronomical. And that would be just for one gene, or for one protein, in fact. And it goes way beyond what's called the probabilistic resources of the universe. There are not enough time even to produce one protein, let alone all of these complex things that interact with us. I remember having a discussion with a senior colleague of mine. There was a particular protein that we were working on, or I was working on. We had a molecule that actually seemed to upregulate this particular enzyme. And when we talk about enzymes, these are the things that do a lot of, they do a lot of good stuff for your body. Anyway, we got this molecule. Instantly, I'll tell you one other thing about this molecule. Has anybody heard of resveratrol? One? Yes. Okay. So resveratrol is actually a molecule that has been around for a little while now, and in fact, it was also a colleague in my department, but in relation to when he was at Harvard. But they discovered that this particular molecule seems to drive what they call the longevity enzymes. Now, you might not have heard of these. They're called silent information regulators. But anyway, it seemed to drive those. And it was so exciting, or at least he was such a good salesman, that he was able to go to GlaxoSmithKline, the big pharmaceutical company, and convince them to buy the patent that they'd taken out for the fact that this molecule and ones like it will stimulate this longevity enzyme. And they paid $740 million to him. Now, the university got most of it. I think he only got about $4 million, but that's the life of scientists, sorry. But the bottom line to that was that resveratrol molecule, and we happened to be working in the area at the time, it was later shown that that was probably incorrect, even what he sold to GSK. But that's okay, the money was already paid. What we actually found was that this molecule resveratrol actually stimulated an enzyme that produced another molecule, which is the one that we'd been working on, and this molecule was necessary to drive the longevity enzyme, so it probably went in that direction. Anyway, that particular molecule, and I was talking with one of the senior sort of medicinal chemists there, and we were just talking about it and how it binds. It binds normally. There's this binding pocket. I'm just looking at your faces. Close to lunch. I recognise. I won't give you any more. But anyway, normally it binds into this binding pocket, and there's great little interactions between this molecule and that molecule, and it binds, and then this one twists and all that sort of stuff. And we were just discussing that. This one seems to bind somewhere else that actually makes it easier to bind. But anyway, as we were talking about that, I could see that he said, and I made the comment to him, I said, just amazing how that could come about just on its own. He didn't pick up on it. He goes, yes, it is, isn't it? And then as we not only talked about the molecule in the way it interacts with that enzyme, but how that enzyme interacts with, and as you go through the pathway, which are extremely complex, as you start to sort of go, this one goes with that one goes. And he gets to the end after we've been talking about 40 minutes, and I kept sort of feeding him along. And he gets to the end, he realises, he goes, that's absolutely impossible. But then he realised what he said, and he kind of looks at me. He goes, I've got to go. And so he left. He didn't talk to me for over a month. But it was a shock because it's a person's paradigm shift that's being shocked. He's looking at it and realising the things that and normally we don't, evolution really doesn't play much of a role. Really. We don't really look at it in any kind of foundational way. People look at it in terms of, there's sort of a tacit approval kind of thrown in there with it. But what was interesting is that in every discussion that I've had so far where we don't introduce this, I don't introduce anything that's going to create a prejudice up front. But what I'm trying to do is just actually allow people to think in their own area. They don't need me to tell them. They work it out themselves. They're smart enough, as are you. You just follow the through, but often what happens is it's kind of confused and obfuscated, and we're thrown in with, oh look, isn't there something about ice cores here, and isn't the Big Bang true, and what about that footprint over there? Really? They all fit together, don't worry, but let's have a look and see whether or not the mechanism is actually there. And once you look at the mechanism and you go, this doesn't work. So what actually is the explanation? According to Sandford, this is overwhelming evidence against what he calls a primary axiom. In my opinion, this constitutes what is essentially a formal proof that the primary axiom, in this case it was random mutations making evolution, is actually false. Has anybody come across this guy, Antony Flew? Yeah, famous humanist, published a number of, and was very prolific actually, with his anti-God philosophy. And he actually went from there to saying from there is no God, essentially, to there is a God. And he says, I now believe that the universe was brought into existence by an infinite intelligence. In fact, I just want to challenge you. You cannot get away from this. And while there might be popular, and there are popular theories, and there are people who will talk about it at a certain level, and yes, there are always questions you can bring up about certain theories and certain ways we understand things. But there is nobody that I've yet met for when you really take them down to it and you keep working through that, if they're able to follow it through, there is not one person I've met yet who is willingly ignorant. I remember having a discussion again with another senior colleague a number of years ago, and we got to the end of our discussion and he said to me, Ross, he says, you're right, but I don't like the alternative. Now, I'm not aggressive, but I just follow through with the logic. And he says, Ross, he says, you're right, but I don't like the alternative. And I said, what's that? God? And he said, that's right. And ultimately, I recognise that it is basically a philosophical decision for most people, particularly when they have followed it through and they have sorted it through, and mentally they can realise, well, look, this really doesn't work, but I don't want to believe that God exists. Therefore, I will take this. He says, I now believe that the universe was brought into existence by an infinite intelligence. I believe that this universe's intricate laws manifest what scientists have called the mind of God. I believe that life and reproduction originate in a divine source. Why do I believe this? Given that I expounded and defended atheism for more than a half century, the answer is this. This is the world picture, as I see it, that has emerged from modern science. We do not have a philosophy. We do not have a foundational principle. We do not have a mechanism that can explain life. Take it or leave it. And for a significant number of the population, they still want to believe that evolution is true. That's okay. They can. Yes, we know that speciation is true. We know that selection and survival of the fittest is true. We can select from the gene pool. That's all important. That's been there. But is it actually producing life? Can it actually establish life? My conclusion after over a year and a half, and in fact it's interesting because while I came to probably about 18 months to finally come through to a conclusion that says, well, actually, in the end, I don't think evolution can work. Certainly nothing that's been put up suggests that it can work in the way it's working. Now, there's a lot of things that I don't understand, but it cannot work that way. And so, coming back to some of the answers to the others, where do I get morality? Where do I get connection with all the other aspects of humanity? It made sense to me that the God of the Bible was it, and of course that's another big topic. But I have continued to stay in touch, and as I was mentioning to Jack in the car, one of the things that I have done is actually attend evolutionary seminars, theistic evolution. I'm actually, not that I was actually, it was only because the university had a theistic evolution group, and I was invited to be along. In fact, I ended up on the emailing list. So I've gone on to a number of times because I keep thinking to myself, is there something, or at least I did at the time, is there something I've missed? Is there something that I've missed which somehow I might be too ignorant or not intelligent enough to be able to find out what this is? Probably maybe for the first 10 years. I don't think I've missed anything now. I think that there are better ways in which we can communicate it, and I think that there are better, for the rest of us, I think that there is, we probably need to shine up our apologetics a little bit in this case, because we need to be not only for each of us going out with a lot stronger in terms of our approach, our belief in it, but also taking that to our students and being able to give that to others in an intelligent way, not in a sort of an antagonistic way and somehow trying to beat people. No. Everybody's allowed to believe what they like, but I think it's important that as far as possible, we are to create an environment where it can be a genuinely informed choice. Does that make sense? And then people can do whatever they like. So, in conclusion, I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. And as I've said, a large number of people are coming around to this point that we really have got an incredibly, not only designed human physique, not only ecosystem, but the world itself. But I recognise this, that every man has the freedom to deceive himself. In fact, as I was going through this, I used to put this at the bottom of my emails. And while it might go out there and people think that I'm saying it about them, it was actually something that I was saying to myself a lot. Am I just choosing this because I want to deceive myself into a position where I can sit there comfortably and go, no, I'm still a Christian. No. I had decided to give up and would have given up Christianity if evolution were true, because I don't believe, certainly in my opinion, that you can be a Christ follower without recognising him as creator.